Please join me in prayer. Speak to us, O Holy One. Speak to us even through our enemies. Speak to us and we will listen. Amen. So I know you don't know much about my life, but there is something you must know. Most of the closest people in my life are not religious at all. Actually, most of them are not even affiliated with any faith tradition. The only two exceptions are my husband, who is a pastor down the street, and my sister. Everyone else is what you would call unchurched. So this is very interesting to me as we read this particular passage because absolutely every single one of the closest people in my life have asked me the question in direct or indirect ways, how do I love my enemies? For some of them, the enemies are the internal struggles of their minds. Envy, greed, substance abuse, gambling, resentment towards a spouse or a parent. For others, the enemies are professional adversaries or bad friends. People who talk behind your back and gossip to climb the social or professional ladders. Friends who always have the perfect words to hurt you instead of uplifting you. Or the cousin who hacked your friend's account to find out what you really thought about them. For some, I would say for the majority, the enemies are these big forces or abstract groups that they are fighting because we are the good guys. You know, members of white supremacist groups, certain political leaders and their followers, big corporations, the healthcare system, capitalism, racism, and every other ism. And for some, the enemies are tangible, real people that want them dead. The racist neighbor that calls the police whenever my black friends have a cookout. The man on the street that yells racist slurs and threatens a woman and her friend as they walk down the walking path. The boss that demotes you to push you out of an institution because of your nationality. The army of the dictatorship that forced your family to seek refuge in another country. The abusive spouse. The grocery store employee who follows you around thinking you are going to steal something because of your clothes or your language or your skin color. And as I thought about this passage, I could not help but think two things. One, I have had basically every single one of those enemies. And two, the question, how do I love my enemies, is the question of my faith journey. I am a Christian because I ask myself this question every single day of my life, and because Jesus has something to say about it. Maybe because this is such a deep existential question, and because the answer is not for the faint of heart, Jesus stops addressing the crowd, the multitudes that were gathered for the Sermon on the Plain, and addresses at the beginning of this passage, only you that listen. So how do we love our enemies? Before we answer or try to answer that question, we need to acknowledge that this passage has been used and abused by all kinds of oppressors as a way to keep people in unhealthy situations. Turn the other cheek has been a phrase that slaves heard as they were beat up by their owners. It is a phrase women have heard whenever they try to leave those who physically abuse them. It is a phrase people of color hear after suffering microaggressions in the workplace. This passage has been used by many for purposes other than the liberation that Jesus intended for humanity. Argentinian composer Mercedes Sosa explains the abuse of this passage in her famous song, Solo le pido a Dios, I only ask of God, when she says, I only ask of God that God won't let me be indifferent to injustice, that someone doesn't slap my other cheek after a claw has scratched my whole body. So how do we love our enemies when our enemies are abusive? Well, sometimes the most loving thing you can do is to call people out on their behavior. This is what Gandhi and Martin Luther King Jr. and John Lewis did. Sometimes the best way to love someone is to wish them well and walk away. And sometimes the best way to love your enemies is to swallow your pride and embrace them. But regardless of how we choose to love our enemies or who our enemies are, there is one common denominator. We must know our enemy. Because we cannot love that which we don't know. So we have to roll up our sleeves, look at the enemy in the eye, and get to know them. Psychologist and Buddhist practitioner Tara Brach shares this story of how, the night before his enlightenment, the Buddha fought a great battle with the demon god Mara, who attacked the then Bodhisattva Siddhartha Gautama with everything he had. Having failed, Mara left in disarray on the morning of the Buddha's enlightenment. Yet, it seems Mara was only temporarily discouraged. Even after the Buddha had become deeply revered throughout India, Mara continued to make unexpected appearances. The Buddha's loyal attendant, Ananda, always on the lookout for any harm that might come to the teacher, would report with dismay that the evil one had again returned. Instead of ignoring Mara or driving him away, the Buddha would calmly acknowledge his presence, saying, I see you, Mara. He would then invite him for tea and serve him as an honored guest. Mara would stay for a while and then go. We cannot love that which we don't know. On our luncheon lectionary this Thursday, someone shared about an organization called the People's Supper that, and I'm quoting, uses shared meals to build trust and connection among people of different identities and perspectives. People who would call each other enemies in another setting commit to dining 5 times with each other and get to know each other. We cannot love what we don't know. That same day, on Thursday, Pastor Terry shared the story of how a UCC pastor invited in the protesters outside her church from the Westboro Baptist Church, a group of people that had few, if any, kind words towards her. We cannot love that which we don't know. My friend Paul was a pastor of a Korean Presbyterian church nested in the middle of a Hispanic neighborhood in a big city in Texas. Weeks after starting his job as pastor there, the church was vandalized by a gang of Latinx teenagers who lived in the neighborhood. The church, over the years, had increased the security to the point of having toll gates all around the property. So he was very disappointed to learn that the gates didn't stop the problem. So he decided to know the enemy and pray for the enemy and forgive the enemy. He removed the gates and started meeting the Latinx youth. He opened the youth group and Bible studies to these kids and fed them several times a week. At some point, he hired a Spanish-speaking youth leader. In a matter of a couple of years, vandalism had ceased, and the number of Latinx youth had tripled and surpassed the number of Korean youth. This is the thing. Once we know someone, it is hard to see them as them instead of us. It doesn't even take much. A few years ago, I took a meditation class led by a Tibetan Buddhist called Cognitively Based Compassion Training. In this class, I heard the story of a study done once in England. The study consisted of a man pretending to have a heart attack in the middle of a college campus. The first time they tried, only 30% of people helped him. They tried months later. Same man, same fake heart attack. But this time, the only difference was that the man was wearing the jersey of the local football team. This time, only 30% did not help him. A jersey was enough knowledge for the students to know this guy was one of them. Suddenly, he was part of the inner circle. Friends, there is no easy answer to the question, how do we love our enemies? And if there is, I don't know it. Otherwise, why am I in church, right? There is no easy way to love. But enemies are real. And we cannot just spiritualize them. And whatever way we choose to love our enemies, it all starts with being truly curious about who our enemies are. Love starts with knowing the other, with really wanting to be in their shoes for just a fraction of time. The same way Jesus sat and dined with tax collectors, religious hypocrites, false friends, and all kinds of enemies. Jesus widened the circle, the inner circle. May we all surround ourselves with enemies and invite them for tea. Amen.